The flames were an inferno, a roaring orange beacon against the black sky of Christmas Eve, 1945. They devoured the timber frame of the Sodder family home in Fayetteville, West Virginia, with a terrifying, unnatural speed. Outside, in the freezing cold, stood George and Jenny Sodder, along with 4 of their 10 children who had escaped. But inside, on the second floor, 5 of their children were trapped. Maurice, 14, Martha, 12, Louis, 9, Jenny, 8, and Betty, 5. George Sodder, a man of profound physical strength, smashed a window, cutting his arm to the bone, desperate to get back inside. But the wall of fire beat him back. He screamed for his older sons to grab the heavy-duty ladder that was always kept leaning against the side of the house. It wasn't there. In a blind panic, he ran to his 2 large coal trucks, intending to drive them to the house and climb onto the cabs to reach the second-story windows. He turned the key. The engines were dead. He tried the second truck. Dead. Both had worked perfectly the day before. He raced to a nearby rain barrel to gather water. The water inside was frozen solid. The phone line from the house was dead. A neighbor had to race into town to find the fire chief. By the time the Fayetteville Fire Department arrived at 8 a.m., a full 7 hours after the blaze began, the house was nothing but a smoking pit of ash. The 5 children were gone. The official verdict was swift and tragic. Accidental death. 5 children lost to a terrible Christmas fire. But a question, whispered at first, then shouted, began to haunt the ashes. How can 5 children burn to death in a house fire and leave behind absolutely nothing? Not a bone, not a tooth, not a single shred of physical evidence that they were ever there at all? To understand the mystery that would consume a family and baffle a nation for the rest of the 20th century, we must first understand the man at its center, George Sodder. George Sodder, born Giorgio Soddy in Sardinia, Italy, was a true American immigrant success story. He was wealthy, respected, and in the small, insular coal town of Fayetteville, fiercely outspoken. He had built a successful trucking company from nothing, but his opinions had made him enemies. Fayetteville had a large and vibrant Italian-American community, and many within it were sympathetic to the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini. George was not. He was vehemently, loudly anti-Mussolini. He argued with his neighbors, his customers, and his business rivals. His daughter Sylvia would later recall that the arguments became very, very hot. This animosity was the backdrop for a series of strange and threatening omens in the months leading up to the fire. A life insurance salesman, after being rebuffed by George, grew angry. He warned him, "Your goddamn house is going to go up in smoke, and your children are going to be destroyed. You're going to be paid back for all the dirty remarks you've been making about Mussolini." Another stranger, pretending to look for work, came to the house and pointed to the 2 fuse boxes in the back. "This is going to cause a fire someday," he said. George, alarmed, had the local power company inspect the wiring. They declared it perfectly safe. Just before Christmas, the older Sodder boys noticed a strange car parked along the main highway, its occupants watching the younger children as they walked home from school. Then came the night of the fire, the 24th of December, 1945. It began with an eerie, mundane detail. Around 10 p.m., the phone rang. Jenny Sodder answered. It was a woman she didn't know, asking for a name she didn't recognize. She had the wrong number, Jenny recalled, and a weird laughing voice in the background. Jenny, who had been asleep, noted that the house was quiet. The children who were still awake, Martha and the younger ones, had been allowed to stay up late to play with their new Christmas toys. She reminded them to close the front door and turn out the lights before going back to bed. At 12:30 a.m., she awoke again to a sound, a loud thud on the roof, and then a rolling noise. She ignored it and went back to sleep. At 1 a.m., she woke for the 3rd time. The house was full of smoke. George's office was on fire. The flames centered around the fuse box and the telephone line. The escape was a blur of chaos. George, Jenny, and 4 of the children, John, 2, 3 home on leave from the Army. George Jr., 16, Marianne, 17, and Sylvia, 2, scrambled out. They yelled for the children upstairs. They heard nothing. And this is where the perfect, terrible alignment of coincidences began. The missing ladder, the dead trucks, the frozen water, the cut phone line which a telephone repairman would later confirm, The fire department's response was, by any measure, inexplicable. The fire chief, F.J. Morris, didn't even drive the fire truck. He drove a personal car. The full crew wasn't assembled for hours. By the time they arrived, the sun was rising and the case, it seemed, was closed. On December 30, 5 days later, death certificates were issued for all 5 children. Cause of death, fire, or suffocation. For George and Jenny, this was not an explanation. It was an impossibility, and it marked the beginning of their new life as detectives. Their first question was the most obvious. Where were the bodies? The official story, pushed by Fire Chief Morris, was that the fire had been so hot it had cremated the bodies, but the Sodders knew this was wrong. The fire, which had consumed the house in just 45 minutes, was a wood frame fire. It could not have generated the 2,000-degree heat required for multiple hours to incinerate human bone. George and Jenny began their own experiments. They consulted a crematorium expert who confirmed their suspicions. Bone and teeth are the last things to surrender. Even in a professional cremation, fragments remain. In a house fire, full skeletons would be found. The local fire chief's behavior only deepened their suspicion. Chief Morris claimed he had found a heart in the ashes, which he had secretly buried in a small box. He told this to George, apparently to placate him. When George and a private investigator he'd hired asked to see the spot, Morris led them to it. They dug. They found the box. Inside was a fresh beef liver, untouched by the fire. It was a gruesome, bizarre lie. Morris later confessed he had invented the story, hoping it would make the Sodders stop their questions and accept their children's deaths. The family's doubts hardened into certainty. They began to dismantle the accidental fire theory, piece by piece. First, the fire's origin. The faulty wiring theory was nonsense. The power company had certified the wiring. More importantly, when Jenny had woken up to the smell of smoke, the downstairs lights were on. An electrical fire that started at the fuse box would have cut the power. The Sodders came to believe the fire was arson, a distraction. Jenny's memory of the thud on the roof became a key piece of evidence. Months later, their youngest daughter, Sylvia, found a small, dark green object in the brush nearby. It was a hard rubber object, like a pineapple or a hand grenade-style incendiary device. Other witnesses came forward. A bus driver who passed through Fayetteville late that night claimed he saw people in a car throwing fireballs at the Sodder house. The family now had a new, terrifying narrative. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate act of arson, combined with a sophisticated kidnapping. This is the second great theory, the one the Sodder family believed until their dying day. The children were not in the house. The fire was set to cover their abduction. The evidence for this is entirely circumstantial, yet it forms a web of coincidences so dense it is impossible to ignore. Consider the motive. George's vocal hatred for Mussolini. The threats were real. The Italian mafia, or at least organized criminal elements within the community, could have been responsible. A kidnapping for ransom, or simple, brutal revenge. Consider the logistics. The cut phone line. The stolen ladder, which was later found tossed in an embankment 75 feet from the house. The disabled truck someone, they believed, had tampered with the engines. This was not a random act. It was a coordinated, pre-planned operation. But the most compelling and most heartbreaking evidence came after the fire. The sightings. As the story spread, tips began to pour in. A woman who ran a tourist stop between Fayetteville and Charleston, about 50 miles away, claimed she saw the children. She says she served them breakfast on Christmas morning. They were in a car with Florida license plates, accompanied by 2 men and 2 women, all of whom looked Italian. She said the children seemed confused and the adults were hostile, refusing to let them linger. A waitress at a hotel in Charleston, South Carolina, made a similar report. A week after the fire, she claimed to have served the children. They were again with 2 men and 2 women. When she tried to speak to the children, one of the men turned and looked at me with a threatening, mean look. I was frightened. For years, the tips came. A woman in Street Lewis claimed she knew Martha, who was living in a convent. A man in Texas claimed to have overheard a drunken confession to the crime. George and Jenny investigated every single lead. George traveled thousands of miles, his pockets full of cash, chasing ghosts. He put up posters. He offered a $5,000 reward, which he later doubled. The police, who had long since closed the case, viewed him as a grieving father driven mad by loss. But the Sodders would not be deterred. In 1949, 4 years after the fire, they had become so convinced of a cover-up that George brought in a newfangled piece of equipment, a bulldozer, and began to excavate his own property. He intended to sift the soil of the basement to prove once and for all that no remains were there. The town and the authorities were horrified, but they watched. Over 3 days, George and his sons painstakingly moved tons of earth. They found a few charred household items, some coins, a dictionary, but they did not find a single human bone, not one vertebra, not one tooth. The excavation did produce one new startling piece of evidence. A pathologist from Washington, D.C., Oscar Hunter, examined the soil and found something the official fire marshals had missed: several small, hard fragments. He identified them as human vertebrae. This seemed, for a moment, to solve the case. The children had died, but Hunter's report was more confusing than conclusive. He stated the bones were from a single individual, aged 16 to 22. None of the missing children were in that age range. He also stated, crucially, that there were no signs of charring on the bones. They had not been in a fire. The bones, he concluded, had likely been part of the field dirt George had used to build the house cemetery soil, perhaps. It was another dead end. Or was it? To the Sodders, it was more proof of a conspiracy. Had someone planted the bones? Was the fire chief, F.J. Morris, who had once claimed to find a heart and then a beef liver, involved in a cover-up from the very beginning? The family locked on to this idea. They began to believe the Fayetteville police and fire department were in on it, perhaps paid off by the same people who had threatened George. George and Jenny gave up on their lives. They did not rebuild. Instead, they turned the charred patch of land where their home had been into a memorial garden for their missing children. And in 1952, they erected a massive, heartbreaking billboard along Route 16. It featured the faces of the 5 children, their names, and the story of the fire. What was the motive? It blared. How could 5 children be burned in a house fire and no bones be found? It offered a $10,000 reward for any information. That billboard would stay there for the rest of their lives. Then, in 1968, more than 20 years after the fire, came the final, most cryptic, and most disturbing clue. A letter arrived at the Sodder home, postmarked in Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a young man in his late 22nd. He had dark, curly hair and a strong, familiar face. On the back of the photo, a cryptic message was scrawled: Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Illa boys, a 90132 or a 90135. The resemblance to their son Louis, who would have been about that age, was uncanny. The mention of his older brother, Frankie, John, was correct. The family was electrified. They hired another private detective and sent him to the return address in Kentucky. The detective went, and he was never heard from again. He too vanished. So, what are we left with? Was this a tragic accident? A perfect storm of bad luck on a cold Christmas night? Did a faulty wire, a dead phone, a missing ladder, a frozen barrel, and a pair of stalled trucks all converge by chance? Did the fire burn with a mysterious preternatural heat that obliterated all 5 bodies, defying the laws of forensic science? Or are we looking at a darker, more complex truth? A cold-blooded, meticulously planned kidnapping, motivated by ethnic hatred and fascist politics. A conspiracy so successful that it silenced the police, the fire department, and erased 5 children from the world, leaving their parents to chase phantom sightings and cryptic photographs for 40 years. George Sodder died in 1968, his billboard still standing, his questions unanswered. Jenny Sodder died in 1989. Until her death, she wore black every day. She never stopped tending the memorial garden on the site of the house. The last surviving child, Sylvia, the 2-year-old who escaped that night, is an old woman now. She still believes her siblings were taken. The case, officially, remains open in Fayetteville, West Virginia. A file on a police chief's desk, holding a mystery that is now more than 3/4 of a century old. The billboard is gone. The garden is overgrown. But the void remains, a dark space in a family photograph. We are left with the silence and the eternal, agonizing question, what happened to the Sodder children?